The 19th Amendment, also known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, settled the long-standing debate surrounding a woman's right to vote in the U.S. After several years of rallies and protests by suffragists to pass this amendment, diplomacy eventually won over as the amendment was finally passed by Harry Burns in 1920, permanently altering the USA's government and women's rights. After women finally had the right to vote, America's government expanded greatly in size and diversity, promoting women's rights across the country. Women's suffrage had always been a great problem in the USA and a conflicted topic for all. One side, the suffragist side, believed that men and women had equal rights and should both have fair chances in the elections, as well as believing the stereotype that women belong in the kitchen should be abolished. However, the anti-suffragist side believed women should not have voting rights, and their main reason for this was that women did not want the vote. Anti-suffragists claimed that with all of the care for children in the house, women did not have the time to vote or stay up to date on politics. However, after many years of the anti-suffragists having their way, meaning only men receiving a fair vote in the election, the National Revolt for Women's Suffrage began. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first major event that launched the women's suffrage movement. It occurred on July 19, 1848, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Mary McClintock, Martha Coffin-Wright, and Jane Hunt. This event launched several new parades, conventions, and more promoting of the legalization of women's suffrage. A major step was taken in this movement in December of 1869, when Wyoming became the first state in the nation to pass a women's suffrage law. This included rights to hold public office, own and inherit property, and the guardianship of minor children. Even though this was the first state to pass this law, it would take very long before getting to the last. With this and other successes, some suffragists decided to do what was very risky at the time, and that was to vote in an election. At the 1872 presidential election, over a dozen women, including Susan B. Anthony, tried voting, even though it hadn't been legalized yet. However, these women were all arrested shortly afterward, yet it set a great example for others to take the risk for the country. These kinds of efforts and organized events, such as parades, rallies, marches, conventions, etc., all made a great impact, convincing many to join the suffragist side. This is so because 6 years later, the government showed an acknowledgement of the movement when the first ever amendment draft was introduced by Senator Aaron Sargent of California on January 10, 1878. This draft was written by two major suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and although it failed to pass through both the Senate and the House of Representatives, the wording of the document was no different than the later to be passed, more famous 19th Amendment. When the suffrage movement began, the suffragist side was split into two groups with different ideas. One, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, was called the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA. The other group was led by Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, and Julia Ward Howe, and it was called the American Women's Suffrage Association, or AWSA. The difference between the two groups that caused their rivalry was their way of strategy. While NWSA believed success in women's enfranchisement would be most likely through a federal constitutional amendment, AWSA favored state-by-state campaigns. These two groups, however, eventually reached an agreement and formed a strategy combining both techniques. This occurred by forming a new, more inclusive group called National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. NAWSA formed a more secure passage to the 19th Amendment by forming several state campaigns, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Some thought this was a slow process, however, including individuals Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Later on, in April of 1913, these women separated themselves from the NAWSA to form yet another group called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, later known as the National Women's Party, so as to initiate federal action. Protests and marches were common, the most famous one being Alice Paul's march at former President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. This helped in speeding up federal action, so much so that the first woman was elected to Congress only 3 years later. Jeannette Rankin, a former NAWSA lobbyist, was the first woman to ever be elected to the U.S. Congress in 1916, even before the 19th Amendment was passed. In early 1918, another amendment was drafted by Representative Jeannette Rankin and sent to the House of Representatives for approval. It was approved by House and was then sent to Senate for voting. A minimum of 2/3 of the Senate must vote for approval for this amendment to have been sent on to the state's ratification, yet it failed to reach that quantity and was henceforth discarded. As it went around to late 1918, the suffragist movement faced a huge advancement when former President Wilson declared his support for the movement. This was announced in a speech sent to Congress in September of 1918. Very soon after, on May 21, 1919, another amendment was presented, passed by the House and majority of Senate. Therefore, it was sent to the states for ratification by at least 36 states, or 3/4 of the states in the Union at the time. 11 states decide for ratification before Georgia becomes the first to vote against. At the year's end, Alabama and Georgia are the only anti-ratification states, yet the suffragist amendment is still 14 states short of being nationally ratified. By March of 1920, there was only one more state needed to ratify it for it to become final. In August, the final vote was finally put in by Tennessee, decided by legislator Harry Burns. Originally, Burns would have voted against suffrage until his mother urged him to change his mind, and so he did. The ratification is certified on August 26, 1920, by U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby. It is from that point onward that USA was permanently transformed for the better. Short-term effects such as lower child mortality rate, all the way to long-term effects such as expanded government and increased chances for win all around, were a result of this world-changing, much-debated event that eventually resulted in proper diplomacy.